How about now?
Yeah.
Good to go. Okay. All right. I'm going to take off from where I had left off last week. And you might recall that I'd been speaking to you about the partition of India. And I think the point at which I concluded my previous lecture was I was describing to you the circumstances under which the Boundary Commission, it was called. So they appointed a boundary commission headed by this man called Radcliffe, Justice Radcliffe, and I remember that I talked to you about him being brought out from Scotland, and he knew nothing about India and all of that, right? So that's where I had concluded my remarks. Now, when the partition of India took place, so maybe it might be useful to just go back to just one of the maps here, and this will also be a map that will give us some insights into some of the problems that I'm going to touch upon today. So if you look at this map over here, what you see is, these arrows indicate the transfer of populations. So this is estimated to be the largest transfer of population over a short period of time in world history. We're talking about 15 million people who moved borders, across borders. And you notice that there are arrows over here and there are arrows over here for the obvious reason that I described to you last time, namely that you had a substantial number of Muslims living in what was Bengal, that was undivided Bengal, so comprised of Western Bengal, and then that western portion of Bengal became the state of West Bengal in India. The eastern portion of Bengal became East Pakistan, right? And that's why it's labeled East Pakistan here. And this East Pakistan, as I think all of you know by now, became Bangladesh subsequently in 1971. We'll get to that obviously in a different lecture when we look at very briefly at the circumstances under which East Pakistan was transformed into an independent nation state. But it's useful to think about it at the moment for the obvious reason that in a way the transformation of East Pakistan itself, its liberation and formation into a separate country, was itself an indication of the futility of the two-nation theory. Because what was the two-nation theory? The two-nation theory was that the Muslims constitute a nation and that the Hindus constitute a nation, all right? And so, of course, if the Muslims constituted a nation, then why is it that East Pakistan had to be divorced from West Pakistan to become a separate country, right? And that is itself a demonstration of the futility of that, because of course there were a great many other reasons which we would have to take into account in order to understand why East Pakistan felt that it was actually living under a regime of oppression from West Pakistan, and why there was a movement for its liberation. One of those factors, of course, was the fact that you had a Bengali-speaking population in East Pakistan. And then in West Pakistan, the dominant languages were Urdu, Punjabi, and so on. Not Bengali, of course. So the linguistic divide was very sharp over there. And this is, again, merely an illustration of the fact that we have to consider that what was central to partition was this idea of a religious divide. And of course, the question, I know there was a question from one of the students here saying that, well, why should we assume that this religious divide didn't exist? Wasn't it always there in South Asia? And I think that this is a extraordinarily complicated question with a very long history. And one of the things that we do have to consider when we're looking at it is the view that it's not as though things were always necessarily hunky-dory between Hindus and Muslims, but this history of sectarian conflict was relatively foreign to this part of the world, right? And that's obviously an argument that would require a lot of work, and there is a lot of work that has now been done in the preceding decades, which looks at the religious history of South Asia, and also considers whether much of this history has not really been shaped in the image of the West. But let's go back to some brute facts here now for a moment. Okay, the brute fact is that 1 million people were killed during this transfer of population. And when we talk about the partition violence, some of this violence actually started before the partition in 1947. So, for example, you remember what circumstances I described to you very briefly in my previous lecture. I described to you the fact that in 1942, you had the Quit India movement, the Congress declares a position of neutrality, and I pointed out to you that the Muslim League, which was an organization that was set up with the explicit encouragement of the British in 1906, every archival record demonstrates that. Okay? Now, this organization, the Muslim League, increasingly came to claim that they represented the interests of the Muslims, that the Congress did not represent the interests of the Muslims, that the Congress was a Hindu organization. All right, that was one of the arguments. And the Muslim League, unlike the Congress, did not declare itself to be neutral. The Muslim League, in fact, was able to use the war years successfully to its advantage. One of the ways in which you can judge how successful it is that you look at the election results. Now, when I'm talking about election results, you might think to yourself, what elections are we talking about? Well, we did have elections in the last 10, 15 years preceding independence, but the electorate was very small, exceedingly small. So there were all kinds of restrictions, and these were limited elections, so there were property restrictions. It was not universal franchise, of course, by any stretch of the imagination. So they had elections through the legislative assemblies. You find that 1937, that even in areas that were Muslim majority, that is overwhelmingly Muslim, such as this part here and the part over there, even in these areas, the Congress won a vast majority of the seats. And I think that that's very good evidence of the fact that the Congress did claim legitimately to represent, if I may put it this way, pan-Indian interests. Yes, Dominic?
Do you think there was ever a window where the Congress Party and the Muslim League could have actually sat down and come up with some deal that didn't require this?
Oh, look, that question has been played over in the minds of millions of Indians and South Asians. Could this have been, because effectively, let me paraphrase the question. Could the partition have been avoided? Right? That's effectively what you're asking. Well, you can imagine that everyone's been playing through that. There are all kinds of scenarios. There are all sets of negotiations. This is not a course on the partition. This is not a course on the 5-6 years preceding. This is the backdrop so that we can move into modern India. I could get into what happened, negotiations in 1945, what's called the Cripps visit to India, for example, the Shimla Agreement, but that's going to take us far astray, okay, right? The gist of the matter is that I think there are also some questions that we should avoid, okay? Now, what do I mean by that? I don't mean questions from you. I mean the questions that I think are not going to be productive for our purposes. One, who's guilty? Was it Nehru? Was it Patel? Nehru and Patel are the other, chief leaders besides Gandhi. We're going to bracket Gandhi aside for a moment. Okay, is it Jinnah who was responsible? So there was a book written by Ram Manohar Lohia, a well-known Indian socialist. The book is called "Who Are the Guilty Men of India's Partition?" Right now, I don't think that that's going to be very productive, and it will almost certainly be a partisan answer. Almost certainly to that question, if we pose the question in that way. All right? And the second question related to that is, could it have been avoided? It's a contrafactual. The point is, it took place. Now we have to wrestle with the fact that it took place. We have to understand the circumstances under which it took place, what were the consequences and implications, and how do those implications get reflected in the politics of today. That is the task for us, not really to sort of say, okay, let's try to figure out, could it have been avoided or not, who's responsible, so forth and so on. Right? You understand what I'm saying here, right? That there are reasons why we have to think in a certain fashion about this. So the brute facts are 1 million people get killed. You could say that the drawing of these boundaries was extremely arbitrary. It could be argued that way. There is a boundary commission. Radcliffe is just the chairman of the commission. He obviously has a number of people serving on the boundary commission with him, both Muslims and Hindus in equal numbers. I have not yet introduced other complexities, which I will, because in the Punjab, unlike in Bengal, you have a third group, the Sikhs. We cannot forget the Sikhs, all right? And what is important about the Sikhs is that unlike the Muslims and the Hindus, who could claim that they had a presence in all of South Asia, that the Sikhs had a specific relationship to the Punjab. That this was unquestionably the ancestral homeland of the Sikhs. And what happened is that the division of the Punjab introduced a brutal division for the Sikhs as well. It was even more brutal for them in some respects, because if you look at the history of the Sikhs, you find that lots of their historic places of worship were on the other side of the Punjab. Many were on this side of the Punjab. So Amritsar, which is the most well-known city of the Sikhs, with the site of the Golden Temple as it's called, that's in India, just across the border. I mean, it's literally only 25 kilometers from the border of Pakistan, okay, right? But then you find that the birthplace of Guru Nanak, the founder of the religion, is in Pakistan now. All right? So the division was particularly brutal for them. There have also been allegations that the Sikhs in particular were involved in the violence. I say allegations because I think one would have to investigate all of these things. And again, there are people who have partisan positions trying to suggest that the Sikhs were the ones who were the most brutal in this. I don't think there are any, if I may put it this way, winners or losers. I don't like using that language because it's too much the language of Donald J. Trump. You know, everyone's either a winner or a loser. Usually he's only interested, we know, in winners. But I'm saying that, you know, it's going to be impossible to adopt a position where we say that any one community unilaterally benefited or lost from this. Now, there were lots of other issues that arose. Huge number of people get displaced. What do you do, for example, with these people? So in India, for example, they set up a ministry of rehabilitation, okay? Resettlement card. You know, the original of this card is in my possession because it's my grandfather, right? He's one of the people who moved in 1947. I was rummaging through my father's papers when he passed away some years ago, and I found this resettlement card, right? The resettlement card is people so Hindus, because my father and his family, they were all born in what became Pakistan, the Hindu family. So in 1947, they migrated. And when they migrated, typically when people migrated, it meant they lost all their ancestral land, property. Some, of course, didn't have any, but the ones who did. And you're not talking about a handful of people. I mean, that's why when I look at the present debates, in the United States, for example, on immigration, some people saying, oh, we're taking too many Syrian refugees. Well, how many Syrian refugees have come into the US? Guess what? You think it's even 100,000? Not even remotely close to that. Right here we're talking about 15 million people moving either to Pakistan, and who are these people who are moving? Obviously Muslims who decided that that's what they were going to do. Well, if the line is drawn and you're already on that side of the line, you're fine. But what if you're Muslims who get left behind in India? Or what if you're Hindus who now suddenly find that you're now the citizens of a nation state called Pakistan? Yes?
Is this the same as like a refugee status? Like what kind of rights?
Effectively, yes. Effectively, but refugee law, frankly, didn't exist at that time. Now you have what is called the UNHCR, United Nations High Commission for Refugees. It didn't exist as a body. Refugee law was virtually undeveloped at that point in time. So these were resettlement. These were basically, they set up a ministry of rehabilitation. Because of course it wasn't simply a matter of, okay, what do you do with the millions of people, housing, food, clothing, right? But a lot of these people, I mean, they needed psychological counseling and help. I mean, you can imagine the degree, right? Because something very small happens on this campus, or 10,000 miles away, and immediately the chancellor will send a notice, we've got trauma counseling and this and that. Trauma is like 10,000 miles away, my man. What happens when the trauma is right next to you? So can you imagine the scale of this, right? You all got that email, right, that I got, I'm sure, when the shooting happened in New Zealand, and immediately, well, trauma counseling. What trauma counseling do you need here? The incident's taking place 10,000 miles away, right? Well, no, I understand. There are people who might be of a certain religious sensibility and might say, well, this has really shocked me. But I'm saying that, one of the things that's changed is our capacity and resilience to think about these matters. And this rehabilitation ministry had absolutely no time for such things as psychological counseling. I mean, you had to find, as I said, food, clothing, shelter, schooling for the children. I mean, there were hundreds and thousands of issues that they had to address, all right? So these are some of the issues that arise. Very little work has been done on these refugees and what kind of life they had, so forth and so on. Now, one point I want to reiterate before I move to some other aspects of the partition, okay? And then I'm going to move to the assassination of Gandhi. That point I want to reiterate is this. The question of the religious divide, we have to revisit this question. It's going to come up constantly. It's going to come up when we look, for example, at the pogrom against Muslims in Gujarat in 2002. It's going to come up when we look at the rise of Hindu nationalism. It's going to come up when we look at the fact that there seems to be an insularity in the Muslim community in large parts of India. So the critical observation is simply this, that in every society, they put it to you, the proposition is going to be put to you in this fashion. In every society, we say that religion is among the other factors that are critical in the determination of identity. Right? I mean, if someone asked, X, Y, or Z, well, who are you? All right? How do you define yourself? So, you say, okay, well, I'm an American, or I'm a Japanese American. I'm male, female, I'm straight, I'm homosexual, lesbian, whatever. These are all aspects of identity. Sexual orientation, gender. But surely you would all agree that for a good number of people, religion would be one of the central constitutive elements of that identity. In South Asia, the British view was, I want to underscore that this is a British view. Whether it's an Indian view or not is something that could actually be contested. But the British view unquestionably was that in South Asia, more than in any other part of the world, religion is the primordial element of a person's identity. All right? So that before Vinay Lal is an Indian or an Indian American or an intellectual or self-described intellectual, a university professor, right? Those are all parts of my identity. Before I'm any of that, I'm a Hindu. Or if I happen to be a Buddhist, I'm a Buddhist. Right? Or if I happen to be Christian, I'm a Christian. Before I am anything else, I am that. And that in India, and now I use the word India, not South Asia, because we're talking about undivided India, the British view as it developed over a period of 2 centuries. In India, the view was all Hindus will gravitate towards other Hindus, all Muslims will gravitate towards other Muslims. And so, for example, working class solidarities are almost important, because a Hindu peasant and a Muslim peasant, before either of them sees himself as a peasant who should be consorting with other peasants and should be sympathetic to the lot of other peasants, the problem is that the Hindu peasant first thinks of himself as a Hindu. The Muslim peasant first thinks of himself as a Muslim. All right? And by the way, you could see the implications of this in newspapers even down through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Because typically, I would pick up a newspaper. Back on those days, one of the major newspapers, it still exists, but it's a shadow of what it used to be, the Times of India, right? And in the Times of India, there would be a small clipping. And that small clipping would be, there was a conflict where a Hindu peasant killed a Muslim peasant killed a Hindu landlord. Okay? Now, you think to yourself, why do you even have to identify the peasant as Muslim and the landlord as Hindu? Because peasants do kill landlords at times. It's a class conflict. But the idea was that class becomes subordinate to the question of religion. Right? This is the central question that runs through the story of partition, and that takes us through, the 60s, 70s, 80s, down to the present day. How does one assess the question of religion in the public sphere? Now, what are some of the other complications that arise, okay, from looking, and some of these are important to consider because the foundations of post-1947 India have much to do with that, okay? And so one of the fundamental questions that arises is, what happened to the native states? You remember this slide that I showed you last time, that I told you that there were over 500, actually the number is a little over 600, over 600 native states, also known as princely states. All right? And as you look at the map over here, you can tell from the key here. So all of this and the lighter shade is British India, and then you get the native states. When we say Hyderabad, by the way, we can refers to both the city of Hyderabad, but in this case, the state of Hyderabad, which was a very large state. All right? Now, let's take very briefly 2 illustrations of the problem. Because when India became free and Pakistan was carved out, these 600 plus native states were all given 3 options. The third option was impractical, and not one state was able to claim that option, but it was there. What were the 3 options? The 3 options were that every native state will sign a treaty of accession. Okay? A treaty of accession, that, if you want to, another word, integration, into India. Option 2, the state will sign a treaty of accession to Pakistan. Right? Option 3, what do you imagine option 3 was? Anyone? Yeah. Sorry? Unity. What would that mean? I mean, if you were a small native state, unity with whom? Because option 1 is unity with India. Option 2 is unity with Pakistan. What's option 3? Independence. Right? Option 3 is independence. That you claim autonomy and you become a sovereign state. Now, of course, some of the vast majority of these states were so small that it was not an option. Right? It was not an option at all. And it became a problem in a few cases. So what we want to do is we want to consider 2 cases where it did become a problem. Right? And one of those problems was resolved relatively soon. The other remains unresolved down to the present day. I'm speaking here, of course, of Kashmir. All right? But let's first look at the problem that was resolved, okay, in some fashion or the other. Here I'm speaking about the state of Hyderabad. So the state of Hyderabad was run by a Muslim ruler. The ruler was called the Nizam. There are different titles for rulers. He's called the Nizam of Hyderabad. Reputedly, the wealthiest man in the world by a long margin. Richer than Rockefeller, who was the chairman of the Standard Oil Company, okay, and numerous other tycoons of that time, all right? So Hyderabad got a Muslim ruler, but the state as a whole, 87% of the population was Hindu, as a whole. The city of Hyderabad had a large Muslim population. In fact, old Hyderabad would have been predominantly Muslim, the city. what is now the city of Hyderabad. But the state of Hyderabad as a whole, and you can see it's a very large state, right, in the south, was overwhelmingly Hindu. The elite, because the ruler was a Muslim, the court, if I may put it this way, and the elites were largely Muslims. Okay? Now, the Nizam was also known to be anti-democratic and tyrannical. There's a very complicated set of questions which we cannot at all enter into. I'm going to constantly tell you about things that we cannot do because of the constraints, such as, for example, that when there was a freedom struggle going on in British India, what about the native states? Were there demands for rights in all of these native states? To what extent did the rulers of these states agree to these democratic movements or anti-colonial movements, right? And of course, the answer is going to vary from one state to another. The majority of them, I can tell you, were not sympathetic to democratic citizens' movements at all. But then there were some rulers who happened to be quite enlightened. If you go down to the south of India, I'm telling you that you'll see why I'm telling you this right now. If you look at this over here, Cochin and Travancore, so these are two states, two native states. And for those of you who have some familiarity with India, you'll know that this strip here, this is now the state of Kerala. Okay? And Kerala is an anomaly in India. Why is it an anomaly? For example, it has a 99% literacy rate. 99%. And that's both male and female literacy. Right? That's an anomaly. Because there are parts of Rajputana, where you see Rajputana over there on the left, so present-day Rajasthan, there are districts of present-day Rajasthan where the female literacy rate is 10%. 10%. One of the hazards about talking about India as a whole, huge hazards. I'll give you one illustration. Now, what is the relationship of all of this? That many people think that the state of Kerala is progressive because it was also, I'm introducing a lot of new facts here, and all of them are bizarre in their own fashion. But the state of Kerala would have eventually, post-1947, the first democratically elected communist government in the world. Yes. And one of the things that the communists did was they introduced sweeping reforms, sweeping land reforms. They also introduced literacy, as was done in Cuba and in Nicaragua. So many people say, it all goes back to what the communists did. Well, not entirely. Because Cochin and Travancore were very progressive states. Very progressive. The rulers of these states. So the literacy rates, in other words, were already high in that part of the country. What the communists did when they came along, of course they increased it, and then they took the credit and said, it's all because of what we did that we have very high literacy rates in the state of Kerala. No. Right? So that's not the case. But so this is an illustration of the fact that there are variations within the native states with respect to what extent they were sympathetic to citizens' movements. But that's a very large question. I just am informing you that this is a consideration, even when you're looking at the constitution of present-day India. So what was the third option now? Now the third option was you try to become independent. Now if you are a landlocked state over here, okay, you're not, what would that mean? And you're very small, what would it mean to have independence? So for the vast majority of the states, this was not an option. And in any case, many of them were presided over either by people who were explicitly Muslim rulers or Hindu rulers, and the citizens, the subjects of those states also happened to share the religion of the ruler, so it was more or less easily decided. Okay? Now let's go back to the complication, Hyderabad. So we started with the facts. And the facts have, as I've enumerated, Muslim ruler, majority Hindu population. The ruler is not sympathetic to what you might describe as a democratic movement by the citizens of that state. I use the word citizens advisedly because who's a citizen? I mean, it's a question that's coming up in 2019 in the United States, frankly. Right? But I'm using it as a generic word at the moment without looking into the legal implications of what citizenship really means and what it entails and all of that. Right? So in Hyderabad, the Nizam started to express his uncertainty. In other words, when 15th August came around, and for a month after that, he took no action. So at this point, Hyderabad is in limbo. They resonated, it's an independent state. It doesn't have international sovereignty. It's not a part of India. It's not a part of Pakistan. The option of joining with Pakistan didn't exist for Hyderabad, for the obvious reason that well, maybe it's not so obvious because, after all, this is far away too, right? But here at least you had a large Muslim majority, okay, in the eastern part, overwhelming. In Hyderabad, you don't even have that, right? You do have a Muslim population, roughly 12%, throughout the state of Hyderabad, 12 to 13%. Right? But that's not an option to join with Pakistan. So the only option was to become an independent state. Now India was not going to tolerate that. It's not going to tolerate an independent state within India, okay, and within India. And so what the Indian army, so you have to look at it this way, okay, that remember that India had fought an anti-colonial struggle. Okay, so how is it going to now look at a situation like that of Hyderabad? Because if you force your way in, it doesn't really sound very ethical, does it? On the other hand, you can't do nothing, and this is, of course, the dilemma of the nation state. This is the dilemma of the nation state, that the nation state ideology is really taking over now. That is, that what India did was it undertook what it euphemistically called police action. It's not police action, it sent in its army. But the difference is this, and I think this is an important factor. Although here again there are complications, because when you look at, for example, what the US did in Iraq, you could say, well, the US army went in, but you know that there were factions within Iraq which welcomed the US army. There were factions that didn't, of course, but there were some factions that did welcome the US army. Right? So in Hyderabad, you do have a domestic movement. You do have a domestic movement. The communists were involved in that movement. And this is where it gets very complicated, and this is my own reading. Now, you're going to have to do a lot of reading to arrive at this particular reading that I'm giving you in a nutshell. But so let me tell you what happened first, which is that Nehru is going to send the Indian army and they're going to take over Hyderabad, and the ruler of Hyderabad is going to sign a treaty of accession to India. Now, by the way, when a ruler signed a treaty of accession, it meant that India or Pakistan, because there were some states that allied themselves with Pakistan on the left, on the west, that it meant that the government then gave you a private purse. So they said, okay, you sign a treaty, and every year we'll give you a sum of, let's say, $500,000 or $1 million, of course in rupees. And this is to support you, because now you have lost your kingdom, right? So this is what's called the privy purse, right? So he's going to get a privy purse, and Hyderabad is now going to become a part of India, okay? But the real problem I'm suggesting to you is not only that ethical problem of the fact that India, which had been, in a sense, the international leader of anti-colonialism in many ways, and you have to remember that Gandhi and Nehru were world historical figures. I mean, these were two people who were known throughout the world at this juncture, okay? But the other complication is that I think Nehru wanted to basically, in a sense, put the brakes on the advance of communism in India, all right? In other words, what he saw was that, look, if the army doesn't take action, if the Indian state doesn't move in, you're going to have a protracted struggle there, and eventually probably the communists will prevail, because they have the groundswell of popular opinion is behind them, right? It's a mass movement. But what it's going to do is it's going to put the communists in power. And I think Nehru was not particularly sympathetic to that idea. That was one reason why the Indian state moved into Hyderabad. Now, let's go to Kashmir. Okay? Let's go to Kashmir, because there we have a set of issues which is even more complicated. And the reason we do need to spend time on Kashmir, and I'm not going to come back to Kashmir repeatedly in the course, because we could do the whole course on Kashmir and just see what's been happening there for the last 70 years. All right? So in Kashmir, the situation is reversed. How is it reversed? You have a Hindu ruler. You have a Hindu ruler. His name is Hari Singh. And his ancestors had been installed as puppets of the British in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century. But the majority population is Muslim in Kashmir. In the Srinagar Valley in particular, hang on a minute. Yeah, so you see over here, so this is Srinagar. Okay, and there's a Srinagar Valley worth a visit. Okay, I'm not getting paid by the government of India to do tourist work, I can assure you. But if there is a paradise on earth, as the Mughal Emperor Babur said, this is it. This is it. It is the most gorgeous place I've seen, in my life. The Srinagar Valley and the area around it. All right. So the Srinagar Valley is predominantly Muslim. However, I'm going to show you a map of Kashmir later on. This part of Kashmir is all, anyone? What's the religion there? Buddhist. Buddhism is the predominant religion in this part. Okay, and then if you get further down, it's not, because this is not a detailed map. There's a city here called Jammu, large Sikh population. So you've got Sikhs, Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims. But the only place that was of interest to anyone was the Srinagar Valley, essentially. Okay, so 1947, the ruler of Kashmir, like the Nizam of Hyderabad, has not yet made up his mind about what he wants to do. As in Hyderabad, you have this further complication. You actually had a man called Sheikh Abdullah. Okay, Sheikh Abdullah, who ran an organization called the National Conference. So the National Conference is a political party. Now, he was a friend of Jawaharlal Nehru. So you can think of him as like the major politician. Remember that Hari Singh is not a politician, he's just a ruler. A monarch of that time was not a politician in the sense in which someone like Nehru is a politician. Okay? It's like the Queen of England. I mean, you can't call her a politician. I don't know what you would call her anyhow, but besides being some boring old queen. But what we're talking about over here is that if you look at Kashmir, you have a popular movement. That popular movement is led by Sheikh Abdullah, who's a Muslim, against the ruler, but the popular movement is not in favor of some kind of theocratic Muslim state, not at all. Sheikh Abdullah was a kind of a secular figure. And he's a friend of Jawaharlal Nehru, of course, who prides himself on being a secularist. Right? So you can see there are some complications in the configuration over here. And I'm going to have to cut the story short, because it's really a long and complicated story about what really happens in Kashmir. But I have to introduce one phrase here, which is that the phrase was standstill agreement. Standstill agreement was what you might call the status quo. That is that when a ruler had not made up his mind, the government had what was called a standstill agreement. So as the phrase standstill suggests to you, it means let the status quo persist until such time as a resolution has been achieved. Okay? Now to push this, and here let us be very candid, that from the minute I start saying something here, there is a point of view and there are going to be other points of view. Namely that, look, you have to read some account of what happened, and then you have to make up your mind to decide which account is the most persuasive account. Okay? There are accounts that come from Pakistan and from India which vary enormously as to what happened. In my view, the most reliable account of what happened, and I think that I would say that there is a consensus on some of the facts of this account, not on how we look at the aftermath, and that is that in order to push things, Pakistan sent what are called raiders. So these were basically people who were dressed as villagers, as shepherds, but they were basically soldiers. They came down and they came very close to taking over Srinagar, which is where the Maharaja is one of the Hindu terms for the ruler. Remember, it's a Hindu ruler, where the Hindu ruler is staying. They come within 15 kilometers of Srinagar. At this point, the Maharaja panicked and said to Jawaharlal Nehru, I want you to send the Indian army to protect me, because these people are coming over and they're going to take over my kingdom. Okay? Remember that these are not people who are dressed as Pakistani soldiers. They're dressed as shepherds, as villagers, but they're armed, effectively. The Indian government refused and said, we will only do this, we will only send you our troops to assist you if you sign a treaty of accession. You must sign the treaty first. Okay? And then I'm empowered to send my troops to you. The Maharaja did. He signed the treaty of accession. That's an indisputable fact. The treaty is there. The signature is there. He signed the treaty of accession. Of course, now it's been claimed that this treaty was signed under duress, and therefore it doesn't constitute a valid legal document, according to some. Right? The duress being that you've got a bunch of people, raiders, 15 kilometers away, breathing down his neck. So whether that's duress or not, you can figure it out on your own. But he signs a treaty, and Nehru is going to airlift troops. And I want you to think once again about some of the ironies here. Because one of the ironies, it's not simply the fact that you have Muslim majority state ruled by a Hindu king, or in Hyderabad, a Hindu majority state ruled by a Muslim king, because that tells you something about the fact of religious fluidity in this part of the world. It tells you that these are multi-religious areas, and historically have been for a very long period of time, right? And that people didn't always care whether they were ruled by a person of the same faith as themselves. Those are all interesting things. The other ironical thing is that India had the distinction of having achieved its independence at the hands of a man who is the architect of the idea of mass nonviolent resistance. That for the first time, and that's my view, for the first time in history, you have a mass nonviolent resistance which eventually is going to lead to the creation of a nation state. Of course, there were hundreds of other factors, such as the fact that in 1945, independence comes in 47, 1945, Britain was no longer the great world power that it had been. It had now already been replaced by the United States, of course. Right? There are lots of other factors. I'm aware of the complexities, but nonetheless, the fact of the matter is that the chief architect of the Indian independence movement was Mohandas Gandhi. And Gandhi had waged everything on the idea of nonviolence. Now you have got an Indian army barely 3 months after independence moving into Kashmir. Right? That is the logic of the nation state. So the Indian army is going to come into Srinagar. They're going to repel the raiders, right? But now what you have is Pakistan obviously objecting, saying that, well, this part really is a part that, frankly, because it's got a Muslim majority, should be, and it's contiguous to us, because one of the many principles was the idea of being contiguous. That is, that areas that are next to each other, which have the same religion, where the majority of the people are adherents to the same religion, they should all form part of one unit, right? So Pakistan, this is Pakistan over here, right? And here you've got Kashmir, and you've got a Muslim majority, and so the claim was that, well, Kashmir logically belongs to us, right? It logically belongs to us. Because remember, the British haven't drawn a line there. It's a native state, right? It's a native state. So Pakistan is going to object, and basically it's going to evolve into what's going to become a war, as it's called. India will eventually go to the United Nations, and the United Nations will intervene. So this is going to be one of the first international missions of the United Nations. You know, the UN is involved all over the world in various peacekeeping forces, international missions, you know, places where there have been genocides or where there have been ethnic conflicts or racial or linguistic conflicts that have, which have involved violence. The UN has very often had a force there. So this is going to be one of the first instances of that in the post-World War II period. Many thought that Nehru had made a mistake in going to the UN because India should just have crushed Pakistan's forces. At that point, it had military superiority. That's at least the view of some people. That's not my view. That's the view of some hawks, that was a mistake made by Jawaharlal Nehru. Right? Now, whatever one's view on that, the gist of the matter is that this remained unresolved. There was an agreement by India, which India has not honored, but India has given reasons why it's not honored, that agreement. And that agreement was that there would be a plebiscite. So you all know, of course, what a plebiscite is. A plebiscite is where everyone votes and you decide by popular vote whether you want to be independent or part of India, part of Pakistan. Right? That plebiscite was never held. That plebiscite was never held. Because part of the agreement was that Pakistan would have to withdraw all of its forces completely, which it never did. But there's another interesting complication, okay? Which is, and that's where we take a third illustration, but even more briefly, and that is in the West. You have, it's not shown on this map, a place called Junagadh. So it's mentioned in one of the readings. Wendy Singer, she has 2-3 pages on that. Okay? Now, Junagadh was another place where you had a similar scenario. Ruler of one religion, majority of the population of another religion. There, a plebiscite was held. And the plebiscite, they determined that they want to be part of India. So Pakistan said, well, if India has held a plebiscite in Junagadh, why is not holding one in in Kashmir? And of course, we have to remember that there's a difference between holding a plebiscite in an area where the conflict hasn't taken place yet, and trying to hold a plebiscite in an area where a war has already taken place. It's not the same. Because, of course, then there was also the question of, well, how do we even determine whether a plebiscite has taken place under democratic conditions? Because, for example, there are so many people who have already moved across borders illegally over there. And then, of course, there was a whole condition of war and instability, and the condition that India had stipulated, namely that Pakistan has to withdraw all its forces. All right? So basically what's going to happen is that Kashmir is going to become a part of India, okay? But then in 1965 you have another war, 1971 you have yet another war. The 1971 war is going to establish what is going to eventually become the de facto boundary, okay? That de facto boundary is called LOC. There's another acronym for you. Line of control. That's the actual existing border. It's not the border that goes back to 47, because 47, right, after 47, 48, after the conflict, so Pakistan withdraws, but it doesn't withdraw all the way. So there's a portion of the western part, okay, over here. It's known by two different names. The Indians know it by one name, the Pakistanis know it by a different name. So in Pakistan it's called Azad Kashmir. Azad Kashmir means free Kashmir. In India it's called POK, Pakistan Occupied Kashmir. Okay? You can just see from just the names how the politics circulates here. Okay? It's called POK in Pakistan, Pakistan Occupied Kashmir. So if you look at Kashmir now, I'm just summing it up because I really have to move on to other segments over here. I want you to keep in mind then the following. Number one, it's actually a multi-religious state with a population of Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists. And I want to reiterate that because 99% of the discussions on Kashmir will leave with the impression that there are only Hindus and Muslims and no one else. And that's not the case at all. The eastern part, 1/3 of the state is Buddhist. Of course, sparsely populated in comparison with the other parts. But if you're looking at the actual land area, 1/3 is roughly Buddhist. And then if you're looking at the lower part of Kashmir, which is where the trading and everything is, that's called Jammu. So the state is actually called Jammu and Kashmir, right? That Jammu part has a large Hindu and Sikh population. The Srinagar Valley is predominantly Muslim. Okay, and then we're saying that 1948, at the end of the war and the UN intervention, roughly the portion to the west is now going to be in Pakistan hands. It's what's called Azad Kashmir in Pakistan. In India, it's called Pakistan Occupied Kashmir. Okay, and then a new boundary, which is not the boundary that goes back to these times, but is a boundary that is established in consequence of the 1971 war, about which we'll speak later on. That's called the line of control. That is effectively the boundary now between India and Pakistan. And here's a final complication. Namely, that China occupies a portion of Kashmir as well, which is the extreme eastern part, and their claim to some of this goes back to what they call maps, which show that historically this has all been a part of China, so forth and so on. Okay, I don't want to even come into that because it's going to unnecessarily complicate it. However, I do want to speak about the assassination of Mohandas Gandhi. All right. Now, and I'm going to really encapsulate it for you. If you want a more detailed assessment of that, if you've got questions that are unresolved, just go to my Gandhi course on YouTube, 30 hours, and you find the appropriate lecture, and you can get all the detail you want. All right? What happened? And how does one interpret it? 30th January 1948, Mohandas Gandhi is going to be shot dead by a high caste Hindu. He's a Chitpavan Brahmin from Pune. Okay? In the evening at 5:12. Now, in order to understand this, the first thing is to reject the view which would argue that the only relevant consideration is the fact that Nathuram Godse, his assassin, thought of Gandhi as someone who had betrayed the Hindus. Remember, I'm not saying we have to reject the view we have to reject the view that this is the only relevant consideration. No, it's not the only relevant consideration. It is not insignificant, but it doesn't even begin to approximate the complexity of what was happening there. There had been other assassination attempts on Gandhi before. This is not the first assassination attempt on him. There had been 5 previous assassination attempts. Some have argued a few more. All of them attempted by high caste Brahmins, which is a bit of a, when you say Brahmin, they are high caste. So I should say high caste Hindus who are Brahmins. Okay? And almost all of them who were Maharashtrian Brahmins. Okay? So Maharashtra is, so here this you can see is, Ahmedabad is one of the cities that Gandhi was associated with. He stayed there for a long time. He wasn't born there. He was born in Porbandar. And this is the state, present-day state of Maharashtra over here, of which the epicenter, if you want to put it, or the main city is the city of Bombay, now called Mumbai. And then you have Pune over here. This is the city, Pune, or Pune, is a city from which Nathuram Godse came. He originated from this city. Now, it is important to understand the article that you have, which is a fantastic, brilliant piece of work which alerted us to the complexities of what was transpiring there. And I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritty of that either, and the whole psychoanalytic aspects of Nathuram Godse, because, for example, one of the things that Nandi argues is that Nathuram Godse, whose biography he delved into in great detail, that Nathuram Godse was brought up as a girl. He was brought up as a girl because, his mother, when she was pregnant with him, she had already lost 2 children. And so when she had a 3rd child in her womb, she went to one of these holy men, the fakirs they are called. And he said, the 3rd eye is on him. That is that he's sort of like cursed. I mean, I'm kind of simplifying it so that you get the gist of it. So the way to ward off this evil curse is to bring up, if your child happens to be, at that point they didn't have sex determination methods, but if you have a boy, you bring him up as a girl. This will confuse the evil spirits, so to speak. Okay, if I may simplify it. And so yes, she gives birth to Nathuram Godse, and he is brought up as a girl. And one of the things that Nandi is going to argue is that he's going to compensate for this femininity, okay, by becoming hyper-masculine. That's one of the arguments that he puts forward in his article. Now, there are a great many things that are happening over here. That part of the story I don't want to get into, because that's again where we would have to really look in more detail than is warranted by the circumstances. What is warranted by the circumstances is that we need a little bit of a more complex interpretation than one which simply says that Gandhi was seen as someone who had betrayed the Hindus, because he's a Hindu himself, a Vaishnava, and that Nathuram Godse felt that he had to kill him because he found Gandhi to be someone who was overly sympathetic to the Muslims. And it is true, by the way, that a great many Indians, particularly people who came from these high caste communities in places like Pune, they took the view that the person who was really responsible for the partition of India was Gandhi. Gandhi was a person who had to be held responsible because he had appeased the Muslims, he had promoted the Muslims, so forth and so on. That was a view that many of these people had. And I come from, I think I told you that, that my father was a 1947 migrant. And so I come from a Punjabi family. I can tell you, in the Punjabi families that we knew and the Punjabi community, they absolutely despised Gandhi. Despised him. You might have heard of him as the father of the nation, one of the greatest men in history, that kind of thing. As far as they were concerned, I mean, he was a person who had to be despised. And one of the reasons why they despised him was for the same reason that Godse despised him, namely that they held him up as someone who was responsible for the partition, right? That someone of his stature could have prevented it if he wanted to, among other things. That was partly the argument that was put forward. And there were a great many things that were argued in those days. So, for example, one of the things that happened at the time of partition, I mean, no one really thinks about these things, but it is true that they had to divide. So you divide the land, but then you also had to divide everything else. I mean, and there are actually narratives that I have seen where, for example, so you have a school room and you've got, 8 pieces of chalk and 20 pencils and 20 tables, and they say, okay, 10 go to Pakistan, 10 go to India, 8 of the chalks go to Pakistan, 4 go to India. I mean, that kind of division that we're talking about. Okay? But one of the things that they had to divide was the assets of undivided India. The assets, right? Because you've created a new nation state. Well, what is it going to run on? It's going to run on something called money, right? Where are the revenues coming from? So one of the things that happened was that when the war broke out in Kashmir, so some portion of the revenues had not been transferred to Pakistan at this point in time. The Indian government said, we're not going to transfer the revenues. Now, that's one of the ways in which we're going to punish Pakistan. And Gandhi took the view that this was completely unacceptable. This was completely unethical. That if an agreement had been reached that you had to partition the revenues, divide the revenues, and of course his colleagues in the Indian government said, yeah, but the same revenues are going to be used to fight against us now if we transfer the money. So he goes on a fast. And one of the other things that Gandhi is the master of is the master of the hunger strike, which is yet another story, another long, long story, right? But he goes on a fast. It's the last fast, which is literally just days before his assassination. And many of his detractors and critics, including Nathuram Godse, took the view that one of the reasons he had gone on a fast was to coerce Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister, his closest friend, and Sardar Patel, who is the Home Minister. Okay, so he's like the second most important person after Nehru in the cabinet. That people like them had to be coerced in order to give up the money that was legitimately due to Pakistan. That was a view that the detractors took, that Gandhi took a fast for this reason. And I don't agree with that reading, but that's what they argued. Now, if we are trying to understand the complexity of this assassination, I think it is important to understand, I would say, two things. In addition to the whole question of whether Nathuram Godse, who came from an orthodox Hindu community, felt that Gandhi had betrayed his fellow Hindus. Okay, that's one set of questions. But here I want to introduce two further questions. One is that Gandhi was a principled and strenuous opponent of the idea of a modern industrial civilization. Okay? So he writes a tract called Hind Swaraj in 1909. And if you read this tract, which is about many things, but one of the things it certainly is about is that modern industrial civilization actually demeans human dignity. Okay? So he is a strenuous, principled critic of this idea of a modern industrialized civilization and the modern nation-state system, which is a corollary of this civilization. Right? We are all living in a modern nation-state system. Even the United Nations, of course, is completely part of the modern nation-state system. You think to yourself, here is an organization that transcends the nation-state. No, it doesn't transcend it, it embodies it. Which is why, of course, they have the whole principle of one nation, one vote in the General Assembly. Not in the Security Council, which is the only part of it that matters, of course. The General Assembly is just basically appease public opinion, because the Security Council is where all the key decisions are taken and where 5 countries, of course, have the veto power, right? So, but it is built on the idea of the integrity of every nation state, which is why in the General Assembly you could be a country like Bhutan, which nobody even knows exists, and you have your vote carries the same weight as a vote of the United States or India or China. It's one country, one vote in the General Assembly. Because the idea is the idea of the nation state here. And then, of course, the nation state itself is this idea that this is one way of embodying human communities, and that this is the only desirable way to do it. And of course, it's a relatively recent idea. It comes into existence in the 17th century in the aftermath of what is called the Treaty of Westphalia in Europe. Right? And then, of course, what you have to do is that you have to basically coerce, persuade people to becoming subjects of that nation state. Right? So nation state demands loyalty from you, exacts loyalty. Why do you think nation states have such things as national anthems? And why people get excited by national anthems? You send something and you put your hand over your chest. I mean, the most ridiculous, primitive idea, if you think about it, right? But in every country, they do it. You're all supposed to sort of think in sheer reverence. Nation state, some great idea. Well, what's so great about it, frankly? I mean, it's a barbarism, you could argue. It's a way of embodying the sentiments of a people and then basically trying to coerce them into giving their loyalty. But that is the nation state. And the nation state does what? It enforces its borders. It issues things like passports. A passport is a very modern thing. I hope you know that. Nobody used passports when they were traveling all over the world for 5,000 years. It was invented circa 1900. You read a book by John Tory called A Social History of the Passport, and you find out when the passport became a document that you need to move across borders. Right? So Gandhi, and this is one of the supreme ironies and one of the most extraordinary things about this man, is that he is the architect of an independence movement which the logical culmination of which is what? The nation state. But he is firmly opposed to the idea of a nation state because he sees it as the most coercive entity in human history. Right? Now Nathuram Godse, and you think, oh, well, what does all of this have to do with the assassination? It has everything to do with it. Because Nathuram Godse was a hard-nosed realist. The type that the policy wonks love. When you hear policy wonks talk about, politics, it's all about realism, right? He was a hard-nosed realist who said, the only way you survive in the modern world is you become an aggressive nation state. It's zero-sum politics, that if my nation is to gain something, it's probably going to be at someone else's expense, and that's fine. That's the zero-sum politics of the nation-state system, which is why in every country in the world today, every nation-state uses the same logic. What is that logic? National security. Everywhere you go, it's national security. Everything is done in the name of national security. If you want to shut down people, you want to shut down dissent, right? And I'm suggesting to you, following what Nandi says and elaborating upon him, that the principal reason behind the assassination was the fact that Godse said, if we let this old man live on, he is going to weaken India. His ideas are utopian, impractical, they're a disaster. India needs to become a strong nation state, and we need to make sure that we get this old man whose moral influence extends all over the world. We need to get him out of the way. And it is along the same lines, and that's the second thing related. He saw Gandhi as effeminate. He is too womanly. What is this idea of nonviolence? Godse says. You should read the speech that Godse makes in his own defense when he's put on trial for the murder of Mahatma Gandhi. And when he makes a 7-hour speech, and one of the things he says, Gandhi was a womanly character. He's weak, effeminate. He thinks nonviolence is the way of the world. Nonviolence is for women, not for real men. That's his language, right? And he says, look at Gandhi. What does he do? Anytime he wants his way, he's like a woman. He says, I'm not going to eat. This is not how men act, he says. What does Gandhi do? He spends all his time spinning, right? So what he's objecting to is what he describes as the effeminate moral presence of a man who, had he been permitted to live, would have been the downfall of India. That is the real politics of the assassination of Mohandas Gandhi. It's not simply a narrative about Hindus and Muslims. And the last point in conclusion of that argument is, and this is a point that is really made by one of his biographers, Robert Payne, The Life and Death of Mahatma Gandhi, 1969, beautiful biography, where he says this was a permissive assassination, permissive as in permission, by which he meant that the Indian elites actually thought it's a good thing. That Nathuram Godse was simply the man who pulled the trigger, but behind him were hundreds of thousands of Indian elites who took the same view that Nathuram Godse did. The difference is he acted on them. right? Because they wanted a nation state that would take its place in the world and be a strong, masculinized entity, right? And I want to suggest to you, you don't have to agree with this part of it, that what you're seeing in India today, under the government that you have right now, a Hindu nationalist government, is the embodiment of that same worldview that was represented by Nathuram Godse. They despise Gandhi as much as Nathuram Godse did in 1948 when he shot Gandhi dead. Because that is their ambition, is to see India become a world power. And so that's why, of course, you go about destroying your own satellites, because then you can say, hey, yeah, we have arrived on the world scene now. Okay, we'll end over there.